I've finally finished building my router table. This is the worst corner in the workshop to film in, but let's go. We've got a door to help with dust extraction, as well as a dial to dial in the airflow so that we're not choking the router and overheating it. A drawer full of goodies for all the accessories we'd want at the table router. Bit holders on trays so that everything's accessible, and a safety switch. This has got dust collection built into it and into the fence, and there are plans available for this on my website. Just like with the fence, I started by breaking down the plywood into the dimensions listed in the plans. For the most part, this is just a series of boxes out of plywood, so there isn't really anything fancy going on. The one exception is the notches to go around the supports on the underside of the router top. Both of the two side pieces need to be notched. On the joinery front, the main cabinet will go together with dados. So just like with the fence, I'm doing 2 passes to get an exact fit. The 2 sides get a dado and a rebate. The upper horizontal piece gets 2 dados. With all the parts cut, I've dry fit this together. There are 3 screws on the side here, on both sides going into the bottom panel. That's all that's keeping it together, so it's a little bit wobbly at this stage. You can see that there is just enough clearance for the router here. That's obviously taken off this router and router lift, so if you're following the plans, you may need to adjust the length of these pieces to give yourself enough clearance. This middle cavity where the router goes will have a door for access to the speed control, but otherwise that's going to be closed off. The 2 small side cavities are going to get some notches cut into them for some panels. I've got these router bit trays here, so I'll just put them on some 6mm plywood and they can slide right out. They don't really need drawer slides for that. On the other side, I'll store some other accessories. Again, I'm just going to use either shelf pins or some dados. Bottom cavity will get a larger drawer. I've got some, I think they're 450, 500mm drawer slides, full extension drawer slides, and that's where a bunch of less used but still want available at the router table items will be. So there's insert rings, I can get some jigs in there, a miter gauge for example, feather boards, that sort of stuff. For one opening, I went with dados cut with a 9.5mm bit for the 6mm plywood. Rather than using the router pushed up against an edge guide, I picked up this guide that puts the router on my track saw track. We'll go into that in more detail on my second channel. On the other opening, I just went with simple shelf pins, which Kreg's jig makes super easy. The assembly is pretty straightforward. Glue in the dados, and since this is shop furniture, screws instead of clamps where appropriate. Being pine plywood and being humid Melbourne summer, this was always the plan, as the plywood was moving alternate ways each day. The top isn't glued or screwed in place yet, it's purely to keep the centre dividers in place and square while they dry. There are 2 easy-ish methods we could go for attaching the legs to the cabinet. First, it would be to reuse the bracket that came with the table saw. Different table saws will have different brackets, but you know, we could screw this to the underside, bolt the leg in, and we'd be done. We would need to cut the leg down a fair bit, not a big deal. The other way, which I first saw Paul Jackman do, is cut the leg down a little bit so it fits underneath where the fence would come to, the fence rail, sorry. Drill an additional hole and screw and tap into the wood. That's the method I'm going to go for because it leaves a lot of margin in case I make a mistake, and if it gets so short, I can always go for the bracket method. If your table saw didn't come with extension legs, you can certainly make them out of wood, and having adjustable feet is no real big deal. You can either buy them or make them yourself. Since my table saw uses all M8 hardware, I'm going to use M8 as well, though you could go down to M6 just fine, or up to M12. Really, whatever bolts and taps and die sets that you've got on hand will work. Obviously the Imperial equivalent is fine too. back panel to the cabinet needs a couple of notches to get around the tabletop supports. Then a pilot hole can be drilled for the dust collection fitting. That hole allows me to insert a jigsaw and rough cut the opening. With the dust fitting screwed on, I can use a flush trim bit in the router to get the proper shape. This may not have been the best way, but it turns out a 40°C day with no aircon doesn't make the best conditions for decision making. Finally, a hole is drilled for the power lead of the router to exit the cabinet. The back panel is screwed onto the back of the cabinet, clamps keeping it from falling down. Before I get building the door, I wanted to just cover a couple of things that I skipped. So why did I go for that particular dust fitting? Because I had it. You could certainly go for something like this, and that would be a little bit easier. Cut a slightly smaller opening. End of the day, it's not going to make a huge difference, but if it does, and I find there are issues, that's why the back is only screwed on, not glued or nailed on. I can remove that relatively easily. Now, it would have been easier to attach that while I didn't have it mounted to the table saw, but then it would have been actually a little bit harder to get a grip on everything. If you've got a second pair of hands to put everything in position, go for it, but otherwise it's a little bit tricky. The other thing I have done is applied 2 coats of water-based polyurethane and sanded it so that this is a nice, smooth, slick surface. I found just the raw plywood, because this is a bit of a so-so grade plywood, was actually catching a lot of the dust and it wasn't being sucked up. So this is actually giving slightly better results. Probably not make or break, but it is a slight improvement that only took an hour for it to all dry. Kreg's concealed hinge jig works great for, well, concealed hinges. Particularly for runs of less than 10 doors, this is much faster than setting up a drill press and stops. I adjust the offset to what the hinge manufacturer specifies. 4mm in this case, screw in the drill bit and go to town. While the jig does have the facilities to drill for the screws that hold the hinge in, they don't line up with the Hafel hinges that I'm using, which is why I've marked it out by hand. On the cabinet side, I mark out the line for the hardware following Hafel's instructions. These particular hinges easily separate, then just clip back together. They're a treat to use. With the door mounted, I could take it off, then start drilling for the vent dial. This is a series of 19mm holes drilled with a Forstner bit and a central 6mm hole for a bolt. The pattern is then repeated on a piece of 6mm plywood. The plywood dial is roughly cut at the bandsaw. A 16mm blade does not make very good circles. Using a disc sander, I can sand to the line to get a proper circle. The vent cover is secured to the door with an M6 bolt, washer and lock nut. For actually storing router bits, it's often recommended not to use wood. That is, don't drill a hole, put the router bit in, because what can happen is the wood expansion can grab onto the router bit, cause it to lock in there until the wood moves, or it can trap moisture in there, even just the moisture in the wood, and cause some rust. So I'm going to look at 2 alternatives and you can make your own decision on which way you want to go. First option I'll talk about is the one I'm going to go for, and that's these plastic trays. They come in 2 varieties, 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch shanks, and to expand them, to connect them together, it's just a simple dovetail, and I can add that onto the other one as well. These go for about $2.50 each, so they're quite inexpensive though. That's in Australia. I found they're a little harder to find in the US, but there are a few other options you can go for. If you do have a 3D printer, you could of course print something like this. Alternatively, you could print something like Rockler's inserts. This is one I've modelled. You drill a 3/4 inch hole, this drops into that. It's got 2 holes in it, one for a 1/4 inch shank and one for a 1/2 inch shank. Now, I'm not going to use these, so I haven't dialed in my printer perfectly and all those bits and pieces, plus these are $2.50. So I'll include a link to the STLs for these if you want them, but these trays are definitely the way to go. To quickly adhere the handles to the trays, I'm using dabs of CA glue between the wood glue, then applying activator on the tray. The CA will hold the piece in place while the wood glue dries and creates a permanent bond. For the router tidies themselves, I'm just using CA on the first tidy on each tray. The dovetail lock will hold the rest in place. The CA bonds perfectly to the plastic. The drawer construction is really basic but perfectly functional and strong. The pieces receive a 6mm dado cut with a regular table saw blade in 2 passes. For the joinery, I'm using pocket hole screws. The front and back pieces receive the pocket holes on the outside faces. That way, when a false front is installed, all the screws are invisible. At this stage, I'm not actually gluing the drawer together. If I need to, I can always go back and do that, but I may add a divider in down the track, and it's a little bit easier if I can just unscrew the drawer. These particular drawer slides have some screw holes that are slotted for height adjustment, so it's easy to strike a line and eyeball where the screw should go. On the cabinet side, all I have to do is inset the drawer by the thickness of the drawer front, 18mm, and then screw it in. For the false front, I'm using Kreg's cabinet hardware jig to drill the holes for standard size handles. I only have one incredibly ugly handle at the moment, but the nice thing about using standard sizing is I can replace it later. Using the holes drilled for the handle, I can screw the drawer front to the drawer. Then I can open the drawer and properly secure the front from inside with additional screws. The initial 2 screws can be removed and the handle installed properly. I did install a safety switch for the router. The router plugs into the back of the switch. The switch gives me a way to turn the router on and off without going into the cabinet. It also gives me a way to shut down the router using a knee or something like that because it's a very large paddle switch. I'm not going to go into more detail about it because each country has different rules and regulations around what electric work you're allowed to do. Here in Australia, basically nothing involving mains, so these switches are the only way to go. The bracket is just pocket holed into the cabinet side, so if I get a different switch, I can always just unscrew this and make a new mount. It feels pretty great to have this router table finally done. I've got plenty of storage of all the accessories, no going back and forth between different drawers. It's all right here. I've got all my bits laid out and room for plenty of expansion, as well as I can take the whole tray out if I want to take this over to the workbench to do some freehand routing. It's really nice to have the dust containment in the router table. That's one of the messiest tools in the workshop if you're not careful, so the dust collection there is going to work out really nicely. I still need to do a little bit of tweaking with the exact position of the dial for what type of cut, but so far the results are pretty promising. There's links in the description below to the plans as well as to the article, which has links to GitHub for the STL and Fusion 360 files for the dust collection stuff that I'm using, as well as for the 3D printed parts if you want to make your own inserts for router bit storage. Thanks again to Kreg for sponsoring these 2 videos, and thank you for watching.